Welcome to our program today. My name is Hoda Mahmoudi, and I'm the holder of the Baha'i Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland. We are located in College Park, and it's really a pleasure that we are, with this lecture today, we are launching our lecture series for our spring semester. Today's lecture, I just want to be sure that I mention our co-sponsors. It's sponsored by the Anti-Black Racism Initiative in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, the Critical Race Initiative in the Department of Sociology, and the Department of African American Studies. Of course, we are especially pleased to be holding this particular lecture and honored to be holding it during the Black History Month, which is during the month of February. Before I go any further, I would like to welcome our speaker, whom I will introduce to you in a minute, Dr. Williams. But first, I'd like to thank Dr. Kate Seaman, the Assistant Director at the Baha'i Chair for World Peace, for doing all the background work for making today's lecture possible. Thank you, Dr. Seaman. And it's, of course, as I said, it's my pleasure to extend a warm welcome to Dr. Yohuru Williams. But before I introduce the program, I have to go over a few technical matters. When you join this virtual meeting, you are muted and your video is off because we are recording this program. And by participating in this virtual meeting, you acknowledge and consent to your image, likeness, voice possibly being recorded. You will have the opportunity to submit questions at the end of the program by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Today's program continues the Baha'i Chair's ongoing engagement with structural racism and the root causes of prejudice, as well as our years-long engagement with the Anti-Black Racism Initiative, as I mentioned, in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences. This is an initiative which is looking at the entire college and what can be done to, successfully remove some of the barriers to systemic racism. Today's speaker and these important projects are reminders to us all that the work of redress and justice continues forth, and that we are called to engage in the battle for a more just society. Dr. Yohuru Williams, our speaker today, situates the Black Lives Matter movement within the larger historical setting of the fight for civil rights, Black freedom, and Black agency. We are excited to hear his thoughts on this very timely and important topic. Dr. Williams is Distinguished University Chair and Professor of History and Founding Director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas. He received his Ph.D. from Howard University in Washington, D.C., which we're very happy about. Dr. Williams is author of several books: Black Politics, White Power, Civil Rights, Black Power, and Black Panthers in New Haven. Another, Rethinking the Black Freedom Movement. And a third, Teaching Beyond the Textbook, 6 Investigative Strategies. He is also editor of several books and has served as an advisor on the popular civil rights reader entitled Putting the Movement Back into Teaching Civil Rights. Now, there's a lot more, but I ask you to go to our website to read the full bio, but I want to say a little bit more. He has, Dr. Williams has appeared on so many local national radio and television programs, including CNN, MSNBC, ABC, NPR. I can go on for a long time. He has also published many scholarly articles in very prestigious journals. And he has a new book that's coming out entitled In the Shadow of the Whipping Post: Lynching, Capital Punishment and Jim Crow Justice in Delaware, 1865 to 1965. It is under contract with Cambridge University Press. It is with great pleasure and an honor that I welcome Dr. Williams.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmoudi, and thank you again for the invitation to be with you today and to be with all of the participants here. I'm going to apologize ahead of time that I'd hoped to give a lecture, and today may come out more like a sermon. And I think that that's given the enormity of the moment we face, particularly here in the Twin Cities, here in Minneapolis, St. Paul, with the shadow of the death of Amir Locke, which I'll talk about today in the course of my conversation about Black Lives Matter in historical context. And the title of my talk today is Simply Because People Refuse to See Me, the Black Lives Matter in historical context. But I want to talk about this and begin with some conventional wisdom from James Baldwin, who said, "The world changes according to the way people see it. And if you can alter even by a millimeter the way people look at reality, then you can change it." What I hope to do today in our roughly 45 to 50 minutes together is change the way that we're thinking about this moment, hopefully alter just slightly the way that we're thinking about the opportunities we have in this moment and the challenges we have in this moment, particularly when in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd here in Minneapolis in 2020, there was so much promise, and yet in the aftermath of the killing of Amir Locke just a few days ago, by virtue of a no-knock warrant executed on the apartment where he was staying, we have so much further to go. I say this too because when we think about this in the context of the shadow of this moment, it's hard not to, at least initially, focus on the issue of police violence. But the reality is that's simply the tip of the iceberg when we talk about the challenge of racism, or racism as a virus, with it deeply embedded in the fabric of our society and culture. And I say that because in a way, when we think about the principles that we associate with the Baha'i chair, a lot of what you talk about, a lot of what the whole mission of the chair pivots around, speaks to these challenges in ways that are meaningful and that might point a way forward. So it's very meaningful for me to be with you today to talk about this. But I want to talk about 3 of those 5 central themes very briefly, because I think they connect in very powerful ways with the contemporary moment we find ourselves in right now. Whether we're talking about the wave of anti-Asian hate which the United States has experienced, whether we're talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, whether we're talking about questions of environmental justice, whether we're talking about the shadow of January 6th. There's a way in which these principles speak directly to the challenges of our contemporary moment. And the 3 in particular I want to focus on are structural racism and the root cause of prejudice, the question of human nature, and then finally, the empowerment of women and peace. And we'll look at all of those in the context of the work that we're going to do together. But I want to begin by talking about something that doesn't have anything to do with Black Lives Matter on the surface, but really is germane to the larger conversation. Particularly last year, we were having about anti-Asian hate in the United States. One of the challenges that we have in interpreting and thinking about our history is this assumption that everything that we're dealing with is new. And yet the reality, as I pointed out just a few minutes ago, is that these challenges are deeply embedded within the fabric of American society and culture. Here's a very disturbing political cartoon from Thomas Nast from 1880. And it shows a recent immigrant to the United States, a Chinese immigrant being strung up by a group of people, by an angry mob. But Nast did something in this moment to try to communicate something about human nature and how we are all tied together in this interwoven web of mutuality, right? The very nature of human nature is to recognize our shared humanity. And it's interesting here because he depicts the mob as being comprised of individuals who themselves have been discriminated against. And although this isn't an accurate historical representation of where the violence was focused, it certainly is food for thought in our contemporary moment about our shared burden in recognizing the shared humanity of those who are oppressed, of those who are marginalized, of those who are literally, in the case of Amir Locke, hunted and killed. I say this to you because there's another equally disturbing cartoon from 1879 that shows an indigenous person speaking to a recent Chinese immigrant, and he's reading the list of laws that have been enacted to restrict Chinese immigration. And as you can see, Thomas Nast, again, is playing on this theme that those who should know better, who have tasted the bitter pill of discrimination and discriminatory action, who should be committed in some way, who should find strength in that, often are indifferent to the injustice that they see. In fact, he has here, know nothingism of the past, down with the Irish, down with the Dutch, laws providing for the banishment of the Chinese. But it's interesting, you can't read the caption. The caption reads, indigenous red gentleman to yellow gentleman, pale face afraid you'll crowd him out the way he did me. But what's really powerful about this image, again from 1879, is that it depicts an African-American gentleman sitting on a wall in the back, and over his head is written the words, "My day is a-coming." Of course, this is 20 years before Plessy versus Ferguson. And certainly we know the period during Reconstruction was fraught with violence toward African-Americans. But the challenge for us is to understand that in that moment of opportunity, when you had the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, out of that moment of opportunity, there comes great despair because we don't, in an intentional way, deal with the deeper structural issues that the intersectionality that we associate with the teachings of critical race theory that would take on issues of race, class, and gender in a meaningful way. And I say that to you because in another way, we have to think about the shadow of this moment in light of January 6th, in light of the long shadow of former President Trump. And I apologize if anyone thinks that I'm being political in saying this, but this is appropriate in the sense that the mantra, or one of the slogans that arose in response to Black Lives Matter, was all lives matter. But the reality is that, as this cartoon expertly depicts, that was used to deploy the same indifference that I talked about to human life, that at the core was the rallying cry around Black Lives Matter. In fact, if we go back to January 6th and we think about the symbols that the protesters brought to the Capitol, the Confederate flag and a noose, these are symbols of terror. And when we talk about world peace and the importance of women, when we talk about women being marginalized, think about one of the female leaders who stood before the shouting mob, literally, to challenge the lynching culture in America in that moment. Ida B. Wells, writing in January of 1900. What are these killings for, she challenged? For all kinds of offenses. For no offenses, from murders to misdemeanors, men and women are put to death without judge or jury, so that although the political excuse was no longer necessary, the wholesale murder of human beings went on just the same. And when I read that to you today, I can't help but think about Amir Locke. And what have we learned in the 2 years of this racial reckoning that supposedly we had in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, that would lead us to recognize, in terms of the injustice visited upon the person of Breonna Taylor, in terms of the injustice, the murder visited upon the body of George Floyd, of Rashad Brooks, of Ahmaud Arbery, of any number of individuals whose names are familiar to us now, but eventually will, like the victims of lynching, like the victims of police violence from the past, become lost in the thick fog of oblivion. That the process of historical recovery is important because it reminds us that not only are these challenges not new, but they require the best of our energies in our contemporary moment to deal with them, to tackle them once and for all. I say this to you because American tragedies, in some sense, are always born of a repudiation of our professed core democratic values. National Council for the Social Studies defines core democratic values in this way. And they say that every elementary student should know what these are. I find this fascinating. Life, each citizen has the right to the protection of their life. The pursuit of happiness, each citizen can find happiness in their own way. Truth, the government and citizens should not lie. Justice, all people should be treated fairly. But the reality is, we know, as I pointed out, that American tragedies always pivot around the repudiation of those very values. Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, why does it take 120 dead women and girls to get fire safety in a nation which recognized that occupational safety, occupational hazards in the age after the Gilded Age had become a problem? Why do we not recognize the tragedy of Hurricane Katrina not to be a catastrophic failure of technology in terms of the failure of the levees, but a catastrophic failure of humanity in terms of the indifference that was visited upon the people of New Orleans, particularly people of color, left in those spaces, devastated by the first natural and then man-made disaster? We can talk about this in terms of Love Canal and the pollution of our earth. We can talk about it in terms of Trayvon Martin and Christina Green. People often don't connect these cases, but the reality is this is what we deal with when we deal with unchecked gun violence in America, a gun culture that, again, repudiates the very language that these core democratic values are drawn from, the aspirational language of things like the Declaration of Independence, the aspirational language of the preamble to the Constitution, because let's be clear, you're not going to find core American democratic values in Article 1, Section 8, in the text of the Constitution itself. You find it in that aspirational language of we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, so on and so forth. And for women and for people of color in particular, that language often becomes an indictment on what we're not. Because wounds produce narratives. And if we understand that in the context of Black Lives Matter, the history that we're called to recover in terms of understanding this movement, the history that we should privilege in terms of trying to be in a space to understand, again, not only that these issues aren't new, but that in this long history, there's something that we can learn in our contemporary moment about how to tackle them become imperative. In fact, Lebron James in 2017 was shouted down. This is when he was still with the Cleveland Cavaliers, for speaking up on issues of race. But what did LeBron say? He said, even though it's concealed most of the time, we know people hide their faces and will say things. It's alive every single day. I think back to Emmett Till's mother, actually. And the reason that she had an open casket is because she wanted to show the world what her son went through as far as a hate crime and being Black in America. How does LeBron James in 2017 have the cultural memory of an Emmett Till and the Emmett Till case from 1955? It's because the wound resonates. It's because every generation, in some sense, has its Emmett Till. In fact, John Lewis, in his final letter to the American people, published posthumously in July of 2020, talked about this when he said, Emmett Till was my Rashard Brooks, was my Ahmaud Arbery, was my Breonna Taylor, was my George Floyd. But LeBron concludes in a very interesting place when he says, no matter how much money you have, no matter how famous you are, no matter how many people admire you, being Black in America is tough. We've got a long way to go for us as a society, as far as African Americans, until we feel free and equal in America. And articulating that, LeBron James echoes something that we heard from Barack Obama's partner, Michelle Obama, on the eve of his election, when she said, this is the first time in my life, my adult life, that I felt proud to be an American. She is articulating, in some sense, the wound. We recognize it. And it's not just in famous people. We also see it in the words and actions of the often nameless individuals at the front line of activism in cities across this country, primarily women of color, African-American women, who we can celebrate the activism of a Stacey Abrams, but the reality is, as Charles Payne writes about in his book, I've Got the Light of Freedom, we talk a lot about the men at the forefront of movements, but the reality is men may lead, but women organize. And there's a rich tradition of organization and Black organizing among African-American women. I spoke to one of them already in terms of talking about Ida B. Wells. We could talk about Mary Church Terrell. We could talk about Ella Baker. We could talk about Fannie Lou Hamer. But the reality is that we saw last week, in the aftermath of the killing of Amir Locke, one of these moments. And I want to play this for you. It is Nikema Levy Armstrong here in Minneapolis during a press conference, reacting to and interrupting the police chief and the mayor talking about that killing.
Gun at the officers. Yeah, so if you look at that still image, even though you don't see all of the officers, the involved officer was just outside the frame in the direction that that barrel is emerging from the blanket.
But it looked to me as if that gun in Mr. Locke's hand was pointed toward the floor.
And certainly when the county attorney's office reviews that case, they will be carefully examining all of those factors. And I'm absolutely positive they will take a look at that. Of course, we all know these events happen very rapidly. And as there's a gun emerging in your direction, you're forced to make a split-second decision about when it's a threat.
Yeah, Chief Huffman, no, hold on. Chief Huffman, no, not. Okay, I'm not a threat. I don't have a gun. Okay, don't treat me like I'm a threat. This is what I would call the anatomy of a cover-up. This is unacceptable. I'm sorry, it is. When I agreed to work with you on the work group. We talked about the importance of transparency and accountability. And here, what we are seeing is business as usual. And you know this, Amelia. You know this, Jacob. I don't know how you guys slept that night. I couldn't sleep at night. Tears from a mother's perspective, thinking about what happened. I saw the picture of Amir. He looks like a boy. My son is 17 years old. He has slept on his friends' couches for sleepovers. So we cannot sit here and whitewash this and pretend that it's okay. You knew that I was not going to stand for police violence and a push for accountability, yet you asked me to be a part of the work group. And I knew what I thought I was signed up for. This isn't what I signed up for. I understand if you're not comfortable having me continue to co-chair, that's your prerogative. I signed up to help bring recommendations because we're tired of being killed. We're tired of the cover-ups. We're tired of the excuses. And done at the office.
I wanted to share that with you because in a lot of ways, what Nekima Levy Armstrong represents is not only the frustration of the African-American community. What she represents is that long tradition of speaking truth to power. What she represents is what I like to locate in deeply embedded in the foundations of the Black Lives Matter movement. And whether we're talking about Black Lives Matter or the Black Power movement or the Civil Rights movement, or we're talking about civil rights efforts at the turn of the century, you find this strain of consistency where activists have had to speak truth to power in ways that are meaningful. And yet at the same time, contest for something that Nekima Levy Armstrong will talk about in the second part of that press conference, which I don't have time to share with you today, but this idea that at the core, what we crave at the very minimal is simply a recognition of our humanity, our citizenship. You see this in the writings of Lorraine Hansberry in A Raisin in the Sun in 1959. And the brilliance of that play is that Lorraine Hansberry in 1959 is again capturing, this dichotomy of whether this tension between Walter Lee Younger and his sister Benita, and whether Walter Lee wants to spend that money in terms of purchasing a liquor store and a home, or Benita who wants to get a medical degree and then travel to the continent of Africa to use her degree in the service of her people. This tension, that's real in terms of how we compel change. And there's this wonderful monologue that Walter Lee Younger gives in A Raisin in the Sun I want to share with you, where he's talking about the American dream, articulating it in a way that I think is familiar to most of us, but problematic if we're thinking about this in terms of Black Lives Matter, where Walter Lee says, speaking to his son, you wouldn't understand it yet, son, but your daddy's going to make a transaction. A business transaction is going to change our lives. That's how come one day when you're about 17 years old, I'll come home and I'll pull the car up on the driveway, just a plain black Chrysler, I think with white walls. No, black tires. And the gardener will be chipping away at the hedges and he'll say, good evening, Mr. Younger. And I'll say, hello, Jefferson. How are you this evening? And I'll go inside and Ruth will come downstairs and meet me at the door and we'll kiss each other and she'll take my arm and we'll go up to the room to see you sitting on the floor with the catalogs of all the great schools in America around you, all the great schools in the world. And I'll say, all right, son, it's your 17th birthday. What is it you've decided? Just tell me what it is you want to be and you'll be it. Whatever you want to be, yes, sir, you name it, son, and I'll hand you the world. Well, interestingly, Lorraine Hansberry records a story about a reporter who came to her and said, this is not really a Negro play. Why, this is a play about anybody. It's a play about people. What's your reaction? What do you say? To which Lorraine Hansberry promptly replied, well, I hadn't noticed the contradiction because I'd always been under the impression that Negroes are people. To have a slogan that articulates the simple truth that Black Lives Matter, and for that to be so destabilizing to people should be unsettling to us all. We can see it in the writings of prominent intellectuals like Ta-Nehisi Coates, but I want to be clear, if you don't understand that history, if you don't go through the process of understanding these deep roots in American history, you miss that this is a running dialogue across generations, across centuries, about what it means or what a Black life is worth. Ta-Nehisi Coates, phenomenal book, Between the World and Me, but if you're not careful, you'll miss that he's actually taking that language from W.E.B. Du Bois, from The Souls of Black Folks, when he talks about between me and the other world. It's a century-old conversation. He's taking or in conversation with James Baldwin. He's in conversation with Audre Lorde. He's in conversation with all of these Black intellectuals, all of these Black activists who, at the core, have been asking the same fundamental questions. The same fundamental questions, which I think in some sense are captured beautifully in a work of fiction, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man from 1952. And people sometimes ask me about Black Lives Matter, and I like to respond in this way. If you read or have ever read Ellison, there's this wonderful passage in the beginning of the book with his main character who has no name, where he says, "I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me." Like the bodiless head you see sometimes in circus sideshows, it's though I've been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination, indeed, everything and anything except me. I want to be clear about this. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings. In the case of George Floyd, 38th in Chicago. Figments of their imagination, creations of the American media, our tortured relationship to race and crime in this country. Figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything, anything except me. And he concludes, I remember that I'm invisible when I walk softly so as not to awake the sleeping ones. Sometimes it's best not to awaken them. There are few things in the world as dangerous as sleepwalkers. And I think this generation of activists, when I see stay woke as a hashtag, when I see that on t-shirts, they're rejecting the idea that we are in a moment where we need to continue to make ourselves invisible and to walk softly. If sleepwalkers are dangerous, we need to wake them up. And we need to wake them up to the danger of exactly or precisely what we've seen happen in the last 2 years, because in such a short period of time, we've lost focus on the incredible opportunity that could have grown out of the tragedy of 2020. And I'm not just talking about the police murders. I'm talking about the pandemic, which exposed the structural inequalities we associate with healthcare in this country. I'm talking about the social determinants of health laid bare. I'm talking about the digital divide, which everyone talked about in 2000, like this coming catastrophe, which never manifested itself because so many of the people who were impacted negatively by it were so far below the poverty line, it took a global pandemic to make real, to make visible what we all knew was just beneath the surface. When we say wounds produce narratives, I want to go back to Maxine Waters, who came to Minnesota in the aftermath or just on the eve of the Chauvin verdict in that case. And Maxine Waters was challenged in the media for her comments regarding the Chauvin trial, but she was speaking about the killing of Dante Wright by Officer Kim Potter. And she said some things in that moment that upset people, because what Maxine Waters said in that moment is that if we don't get justice in this case, we should get in and stay in the streets. And in fact, I'm going to play this for you for just a second.
I am very hopeful, and I hope that we're going to get a verdict that is say guilty, guilty, guilty. And if we don't, we cannot go away.
And not just manslaughter, right? I mean,
oh no, not manslaughter. No. This is guilty for murder. I don't know whether it's in the first degree, but as far as I'm concerned, it's first degree.
Congressman, but what happens if we do not get what you just told? What should the people do? What should protesters on the street do?
I didn't hear you.
What happens? What should protesters do?
Well, we got to stay on the street, and we've got to get more active. We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure that they know that we mean business.
Now, when that happened, Maxine Waters was censured by the judge in the Chauvin trial, censured or criticized, critiqued by her colleagues in Congress. But I want to understand something, want us to understand something collectively. When I say wounds produce narratives, and that history is the foundation for this, what people forget about Maxine Waters, to kind of see her now, is that as a young assemblywoman in California in 1979, Maxine Waters dealt with the case of Eula May Love. I'm going to play this for you for just about 5 minutes, but I think it's important for you to see this in terms of understanding my larger point about A, the importance of historical recovery, B, the importance of wounds producing narratives, C, the importance of recognizing those voices. In this particular instance, as we've been focusing on today, African-American female activists speaking truth to power in moments that should resonate with us in understanding this kind of these deeper foundations we associate with Black Lives Matter. We play this for you.
On January 3rd, 1979, two members of the Los Angeles Police Department shot and killed Eula Love at her home in a dispute over a $22.09 utility bill. She died on her front lawn before the eyes of her own children.
There is no single event that had a more profound impact in LAPD history up to that point in time than the shooting of Eula Love.
This is where Mrs. Eula Love stood the day the shooting took place. There was an officer here, an officer there. She held a knife in her hand. There was a scuffle, the knife was knocked out of her hand. She reached for it, and as she threw it, the officers opened fire.
This was a big deal. This is a woman who's had a tough time, and she was desperate. So there was a lot of empathy going out to her from the community.
Once again, we have a member of the Black community dead under circumstances that are highly questionable at best.
It has been determined that the evidence does not warrant the filing of criminal charges. This was a justifiable homicide committed by the officers in their own self-defense.
As far as the LAPD was concerned, it was just an event, and everybody was supposed to accept it. This was on the lips and minds of everybody in the community.
The people gonna get you, and it's gonna be in the street.
It didn't help that you had a police chief who behaved poorly and in many ways irresponsibly.
I commented on the media squeezing out the last tier of emotion in this situation where they talk about a $22 gas bill. It doesn't make any difference, but it was a $69 gas bill.
Gates was Gates. He's going to be fully supportive of his officers.
I guess they don't think I have any sympathy for anyone other than police officers, and that's simply not true. I have great empathy and sympathy for Eula Love and her family. Deeply sorry that it happened, but it did happen.
The reason I wanted to show you that, and I hope, again, it would have been nicer if we were in person, but I hope that it's clear. When I watched Nikema Levy Armstrong last week interrupt Interim Chief Amelia Huffman and Jacob Fry, I can't help but see the long shadow of Ida B. Wells. I can't help but see the wound, the trauma experienced by people like Maxine Waters that results in the frustration, but then also this articulation that sympathy is not enough. Justice is really what they're demanding. I want us to understand this in this way, because it doesn't matter who we look at. Take someone like John Lewis. And I also want to emphasize here that one of the things that Maxine Waters began with in 2021 was that she was hopeful for justice. So it wasn't that all hope was gone, but in the absence of that, and to understand that in the context of a life, this young assemblywoman who in 1979 lived through the murder of killing of Eula May Love, where no one questioned the evidence, where no one questioned the account of the LAPD, to looking at what happened today by virtue of body cam of last week. And if not for that body cam footage, then the official line that was offered by the Minneapolis police would be the final indictment on the life of Amir Locke, and it would have been false. If we follow that logic, the same would have been true in the killing of Breonna Taylor, and the same would have been true in the initial reporting on the murder of George Floyd. And I'm not suggesting here, because particularly for the Baha'i chair of world peace, that should leave us hopeless, because the reality is there's a lot of hope articulated by the people who lived through these experiences. John Lewis is born in 1940 in a world in which segregation is the norm. We celebrate him for spilling blood on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965 as one of the activists who was marching in support of voting rights legislation. And of course, he has a long, storied career, history, and activism before the Edmund Pettus Bridge. But this is kind of the moment that most people associate with him. He dies in 2020 in the midst of a national Black Lives Matter movement, and yet he remained incredibly hopeful. But he also, in that final letter that I mentioned to you, penned to Black Lives Matter activists in particular, but to the American people in general, cautioned us that we needed to study the past in order to be prepared to take on the contemporary challenges of today, rooted in the knowledge that our struggle's not new, but our commitment can't waver in pushing for the type of justice that you hear people like Nekima Levy Armstrong arguing for. When I say that, all the focus on Colin Kaepernick, but I like to remind people, 1968, Mexico City, if you think about the protest that was put on by Tommy Smith and Juan Carlos at the Olympics, if you think about the symbols that they chose that day, black sock feet without shoes to highlight poverty, beads to symbolize violence against African Americans, in their particular case, lynching, and black gloved fists to represent, not as it's often articulated today, solidarity and black power in the United States, but solidarity with Black people and oppressed people around the world, bringing us back to those three principles that I talked about in the beginning that are central to the mission of this chair. We connect the dots in that history and we do that work. It puts us in the best position to then understand that this history is not meaningless. In fact, this is a political cartoon from 2008 when Barack Obama was elected president. And it shows Barack Obama sitting at the front of a bus. And when people see that, they immediately think about Rosa Parks. Well, the cartoonist here, Adam Zyglas, is trying to equate the election of Barack Obama to a civil rights moment and the iconic moment of Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on that Montgomery bus. But I always ask people, you got to go that one layer deeper. What kind of a bus is it? Because in 2008, what Zyglas was trying to argue is that we can celebrate this electoral victory, but he put two watershed moments in civil rights together. It wasn't just Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on that bus in 1955. It was the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. And the reality is that today in 2022, in spite of an African-American, the nation's first African-American president, in spite of all this dialogue, in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd here in Minnesota had to acknowledge that Minnesota still lags behind every state in the union in educational outcomes for students of color, for Black students. The civil rights movement, Martin Luther King argued, wasn't just about access and opportunity. It wasn't just about being the first or being able to desegregate spaces. At its core, it was about justice. Dr. King argued this beautifully in his final book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, when he wrote, we focus so singularly on access and opportunity, we missed an important grain of consistency that runs throughout this movement. What good is it to have the right to eat in a restaurant if you can't afford anything on the menu? Civil rights without economic justice are dead rights. What good is it to have the right to earn a law degree if you live in a community like Nekima Levy Armstrong, where you have to witness and be party to injustice and are denied the opportunity to speak out and to demand justice for the same? I want to conclude with you this afternoon and kind of making these connections by talking about another moment in this kind of longer history. And I want to go back to Al Sharpton, June 4th, 2020, when Al Sharpton delivers the eulogy for George Floyd here in Minneapolis. And something that Al Sharpton said during that, and I recognize Al Sharpton is a polarizing figure. So what I'm suggesting here is that we should listen to Al Sharpton's words and try to understand, again, this concept of wounds producing narratives and how important history is in understanding this. I'm going to play 3 minutes of this for you, and then I will speed through the second half of this presentation, and we'll get to some questions. But I want to play this for you, and I just want you to listen to what Sharpton says here, about 4 minutes.
George Floyd's story has been the story of Black folks, because ever since 401 years ago, the reason we could never be who we wanted and dreamed of being is you kept your knee on our neck. We were smarter than the underfunded schools you put us in. but you had your knee on our neck. We could run corporations and not hustle in the street, but you had your knee on our neck. We had creative skills. We could do whatever anybody else could do, but we couldn't get your knee off our neck. What happened to Floyd happens every day in this country, in education, in health services, and in every area of American life. It's time for us to stand up in Georgia's name and say, get your knee off our necks. But I'm more hopeful today than ever. Why? Well, let me go back. Reverend Jackson always taught me, stay on your text. Go back to my text, Ecclesiastes. There is a time and a season. And when I looked this time and saw marches where in some cases young whites outnumbered the blacks marching, I know that it's a different time and a different season. When I looked and saw people in Germany marching for George Floyd, it's a different time and a different season. When they went in front of the parliament in London, England, and said it's a different time and a different season, I come to tell you, America, this is the time of dealing with accountability in the criminal justice system.
A couple of things I want to say about that quickly. Number one, if we think about the 5 principles again, human nature, structural racism, and the importance of women and peace, and then certainly the global component that is the foundation of the chair. Think about this as well. Al Sharpton hits all of those organically. And again, I want to be clear. He's very clear here in articulating a sense of hope, but then recognizing that that hope has to come by grappling with the past. Again, the assumption that this is something new. Jackie Robinson, we're not talking about Colin Kaepernick here, but Jackie Robinson in 1963 in Birmingham goes down to support the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and is talking about an incident that happened there of police brutality. I just want to read this to you. I don't think you realize down here in Birmingham what you mean to us up here in New York. And I don't think that what white Americans understand is what Birmingham means to all of us throughout this country. When we think about the little kids being tossed from one side of the street to the other by the tremendous force of those hose, and we think about this picture, just sickens me. This big, brave policeman down here with his knee on the throat of this lady. See, I shouldn't be able to make these comparisons across time and to draw these out and to demonstrate this wound through so many prominent African Americans if what Al Sharpton was talking about wasn't real. And I want to be clear that when I say that and we think about the history of the United States and all of these chapters, we can use Al Sharpton's metaphor, the knee, and we can see what he articulated in this cartoon by Herblock from 1963. What does it show? A black protester being shoved off the street by a white gentleman. And what's the African-American protester protesting against? Housing restricted, school restricted, public accommodations restricted, job opportunities restricted. This is what I like to call the 6 degrees of segregation. And those 6 degrees of segregation, again, quite frankly, aren't only to be found in that moment, they're also to be found in the words of people like Frederick Douglass. In April of 1865, Douglass is invited by the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society to give a meditation on what African Americans want in the aftermath of freedom. Douglass begins that meditation. I'm going to share this with you. What shall we do with the Negro? I've had but one answer from the beginning. Do nothing with us. Your doing with us has already played the mischief with us. Do nothing with us. If the apples will not remain on the tree of their own strength, if they're worm-eaten at the core, if they're early ripe and disposed to fall, let them fall. I am not for tying or fastening them on the tree in any way except by nature's plan. And if they will not stay there, let them fall. And if the Negro cannot stand on his own legs, let him fall also. I like to remind people that Frederick Douglass is a contemporary of both Charles Darwin and Herbert Spencer. We shouldn't be surprised to see elements of social Darwinism there, but weave into his address here. But I also want to be clear that Douglass is firm in his conviction that it is the doing with, right? The Jim Crowing, the segregated housing, the redlining, so on and so forth, that continues to deepen that wound. But in the next part, Douglass is going to foreshadow the next 100 years of US history. I'm going to put Douglass in conversation with Al Sharpton. I'm going to put Douglas in conversation with Nakima Levy-Armstrong. I'm going to put Douglas in conversation with Ralph Ellison. I'm going to put Douglas in conversation with all of the individuals that we talked about today, where Douglas says, all I ask is give him a chance to stand on his own legs. Let him alone. If you see him on his way to Lorraine Hansberry school, let him alone. Don't disturb him. If you see him going to the dinner table at a hotel, let him go. If you see him going to the Georgia ballot box, let him alone. Don't disturb him. Douglas is interrupted at this point by applause. If you see him going into a workshop, just let him alone. Your interference is doing him a positive injury. And Douglas concludes, let him fall if he cannot stand alone. If the Negro cannot live by the line of eternal justice so beautifully pictured to you in the illustration used by Mr. Phillips, the fault will not be yours. It will be he who made the Negro and established that line for his government. He's interrupted again by applause. Let him live or die by that. If you only untie his hands and give him a chance, I think he will live. Douglas provides us now, along with Al Sharpton, another way to think about this, because whether you're talking about the knee or the tied hands, you can see this expressed in all of those instruments that were designed by their very nature to deny absolute equality before the law for African Americans, which end up impacting other communities of color as well. Let's be clear. We talk about the Black codes, the poll tax, literacy test, grandfather clause, sharecropping, crop lien system, debt peonage, convict leasing, segregation laws. And then when those didn't work, you always had the old standby of violence and intimidation captured by Thomas Nast in these two political cartoons from that moment, and in the enduring legacy of the violence visited upon African Americans by groups like the Knights of the White Camellia, the Red Shirts, the Ku Klux Klan, whose symbols we saw brought to the US Capitol last January 6th. And I say that to you because when we think about these 6 degrees of segregation, as I talk about today, these are the foundation for the inequality when we think about how we challenge structural racism today. It's in housing, it's in education, it's in access to places of public accommodation, it's in disfranchisement and voting rights, it's in unfair labor practices, and it's in the most intractable but also the most visible form of that injustice, Jim Crow justice. Whether you're talking about the school to prison pipeline or you're talking about violence against Black and brown bodies in public space. And I want to be clear when I say this to you today, that when we think about those 6 degrees of segregation, and I got to skip through a couple of these, we again go to these voices of women of color who have always been at the forefront of calling this out. I want to be clear, 1866, May of 1866, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper is responding to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who in the aftermath of Black men being extended the right to vote by virtue of the 15th Amendment, and I want to correct that. The 15th Amendment doesn't confer the right to vote on anyone. It simply forbids discrimination on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It said nothing about gender. In response to this, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who should be celebrated for their stalwart women's rights, resort to white supremacy to make the case for women and say, she says, American women of wealth, education, think about the cartoon that I showed you earlier, the laws of womanhood to make laws for you and your daughters, to be your rulers, judges, jurors, to dictate not only the civil, but moral codes by which you shall be governed. Awake to the danger of your present position and demand that women too shall be represented in the government. The irony is, what about the Chinese, African, German, and Irish women who were left out of this prescription? The irony is it's not the Chinese, African, and German and Irish men who did this, but the husbands, brothers, fathers, and sons of these women who denied them by virtue of ignoring gender. The 15th Amendment to be the true revolutionary addition to the Constitution it could have been in that moment. But I don't have to call that out for you in a contemporary moment because African-American educator and activist Frances Ellen Watkins Harper called it out in a speech she gave in 1866, aptly titled, "We Are All Bound Up Together." I want to read this to you because it's powerful, and I promise I'm wrapping up now. But what does she write? I do not believe that giving the woman the ballot is immediately going to cure all the ills of life. I do not believe that white women are dewdrops just exhaled from the skies. I think that like men, they may be divided into 3 classes: the good, the bad, and the indifferent. The good would vote according to their convictions and principles. The bad is dictated by prejudice or malice, and the indifferent will vote on the strongest side of the question with the winning party. You white women speak here of rights. I speak of wrongs. I, as a colored woman, have had in this country an education which has made me feel as if I were in a situation of Ishmael, my hand against every man and every man's hand against me. Let me go tomorrow morning and take my seat in one of your streetcars. I do not know what they will do in New York, but they will in Philadelphia. And the conductor will put his hand and stop the car rather than let me ride. Wounds produce narratives. The epigenetic harm, the intergenerational trauma experienced by communities of color is the foundation of Black Lives Matter. And when Frances Ellen Watkins Harper says they may be divided, I would suggest to you that this is certainly true of all of us in this moment. It's an appropriate to talk about this in an appropriate way to end, given the focus of this lecture series, that we all too may be divided into three classes: the good, the bad, and the indifferent. And not good and bad, black and white, but good and bad, indifferent in the way that she defines it. Working according to our convictions and conscience and principles, actions dictated by prejudice, or simply operating out of a sense of convenience. I want to conclude with you today by sharing a conversation just very briefly about Black Lives Matter and how we can even see this in music. I was going to play a part of KRS-One's The Sound of the Police. You can go back to Stevie Wonder's 1973 song, Living for the City, where you can capture the 6 degrees of segregation there. A boy is born in Hard Time, Mississippi, surrounded by 4 walls. It ain't so pretty. Talks about the economic despair that his family faces, the challenges of education. But if you listen carefully to that song, it's the breakdown when he leaves Mississippi and goes to New York and is arrested and given 10 years. And then he comes out of prison and he's breathing in the polluted air of New York City. In 1973, Stevie Wonder was in conversation as well. KRS-One is in conversation as well. These images convey that. But I think probably the most compelling for me, and again, this is a cartoon from 1956 showing Eisenhower as the fire chief, and a cartoon from 2020 in the aftermath of the racial unrest here in the United States, picturing former President Trump as the fire chief. I don't know if Adam Zyglis was taking inspiration from her block, but I am hoping that what you're seeing here, what I haven't articulated, but what I hope comes through in the connections that I make, is that this is a long history and a long struggle that we're talking about. Without the historical foundations to understand how we got here, without understanding how deeply embedded this is in the fabric of American society and culture, there's no quick fix 2-hour training that can address this without understanding this history, without understanding it in a deep way. Recognizing the difference between moments and movements, and being in a space where we can look back at something like the Niagara movement of 1905 and see in a declaration of sentiments of these women and men, the blueprint, not the same, but as Rhonda Williams argues in her book, Concrete Demands, echoes of our contemporary struggle. What were they asking for in 1905? We demand upright judges and courts, juries selected without discrimination on account of color, and the same measure of punishment and the same effort at reformation for Black as for white offenders. We need orphanages and farm schools for dependent children, juvenile reformatories for delinquents, and the abolition of the dehumanizing convict lease system. We talk about health in our contemporary moment. Look at the third. We plead for health, for an opportunity to live in decent houses and localities, for a chance to rear our children in physical and moral cleanliness. I could get into the uplift tradition. I don't have a lot of time, but I want to go back to the shadow of this movement and how it ties to the Baha'i chair and the work that you're doing at the University of Maryland, and why it's so important in this global conversation about racial justice and how that ties to Black Lives Matter, which is an important movement. But in the scheme, the larger scheme of history, is another moment for us to consider how we move forward with integrity, with our eyes fixed on justice, so that we don't And we're watching it happen in our contemporary moment right now in terms of what happened here in Minneapolis in just 2 years, assume that conversation equates with progress. There is no John Lewis Voting Rights Act. There is no George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that have been passed. And I would argue they wouldn't be sufficient even if they had been, if we allow business as usual. As Nikema Levy-Armstrong, as Maxine Waters, as Frances Ellen Watkins Harper all articulated. Conclude with you on this note in terms of our own responsibility, and it's looking at the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King talking about the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson in 1965. And King skillfully indicts everyone in this. He says a state trooper may have pointed the gun, but that state trooper did not act alone. Jimmy Lee Jackson was murdered by the brutality of every sheriff who practices lawlessness in the name of the law. He was murdered by the irresponsibility of every politician from governors on down who has fed his constituents the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism. He was murdered by the timidity of a federal government that can spend millions of dollars a day concerned about the Ukraine and cannot protect, keep troops in the South Vietnam and cannot protect the rights of its own citizens seeking the right to vote. He was murdered by the indifference of every white minister of the gospel who has remained silent behind the safe security of his stained glass windows. And he was murdered by the cowardice of every Negro who passively accepts the evils of segregation and stands on the sidelines in the pursuit of justice. King indicts us all, and in the same sense, enlists us all in the work to be done in dismantling systemic racism and oppression by recognizing that human nature, agency, gives us opportunity to write our future in any way that we can imagine. And that imagining means recognizing that systems that were built to serve the needs of a society which was grounded in racial division can no longer serve us. Not a slogan like defund the police, but a slogan like reimagine public safety. Not a reaction against or a decrying of teachings associated with the mythology that has been created around critical race theory, but a recognition that without understanding the deep foundations of history and recognizing the ways in which racism has impacted American society and culture, we can't move forward. And last but not least, in a very meaningful way, putting ourselves in a position to recognize that we are the agents of our own destiny. The reality is we love to tell young people that they stand on the shoulders of giants, but I think that if you could talk to someone like an Ella Baker or Fannie Lou Hamer today, they would tell you that young people don't stand on the shoulders of giants, they are the giants. And the reality is in this moment, what we need are people who challenge that same spirit that we saw in Nikema Levy-Armstrong to speak truth to power, to model what we celebrate in Black Lives Matter activism. And it's not simply the speaking of truth to power, but the power to imagine a future not ground in the divisions, despair, and acrimony of our past. Thank you.
Dr. Williams, thank you so much. I don't have the words, but I'm going to find the words. You have given us an amazing journey, not only into the history of racism in America, but also you have raised our consciousness about the importance of all of us having to look at ourselves and to envision what steps I might take next in order to deal with this continual scourge that exists in this country. And the importance that you have brought to light today in so many profound ways and so many heart-wrenching ways about why Black Lives Matter. And so I'm grateful to your presentation, to your accepting our invitation, and I will now open it up for questions, and I will ask Dr. Seaman to start with the first one, please. Thank you, Dr. Williams.
Absolutely, and I want to join Professor Mahmoudi in thanking you again, Dr. Williams. So the first question is a pretty straightforward one. Can you give us the spelling of the cartoonist Thomas Nast, or Nast, I think it was?
Sure. N-A-S-T, Thomas Nast.
Thank you. Hoda, I think you're muted.
Sorry, the next question is, how do we start to recognize the deeper layers of racism that, for example, Black people may have the right to vote, but are economically held back?
Such an important question. I think that's part of the work of historical recovery. I think it's also part of the work of thinking about different principles, which is why I love the work of the Bahá'í chair so much. I think when we're rooted in a framework that is so, let me frame this a different way. So a wonderful new book out by Isabella Wilkerson entitled Caste. And one of the things that she talks about in that book is that when systems are built to operate in a particular way, we can't anticipate that they'll do anything except what they're designed for. So any conversation about reforming a system, is everyone frozen?
No.
There's everyone. Any conversation, substantive conversation about reforming a system that's running in the way that it was designed to run puts us in the place of actually not being able to have progress. And I'll give you a great example. We all lived through Y2K in 2000, and everybody thought the world was going to end when the clocks went over, and there were preppers and all this craziness happening. And then 1201 came and nothing happened because those systems were designed to run exactly as they're running. And I would argue that the reason why we haven't had any real change here in Minneapolis is that people looked at, the pronouncements of Jacob Fry, the mayor, and said they were going to do all this about no-knock warrants, but the system, that's how it's designed to run. When we think about how we make a difference in the process of imagining, it requires us to then adopt new principles and adopt new frameworks. It's why I think, even though there is this pushback against critical race theory, which very few people, it's not taught in K-12 education, but it is a framework that some educators use, a lens that some educators use to try to open young people up to understanding what John Lewis was talking about in 2020, which is that we need to empower young people to be in a position to understand what things in our society and culture need to be addressed and changed in substantive ways. And the other day I was down in Florida after the debacle that happened there, where there was a professional development that was scheduled for teachers, and it was canceled because there was an image of Colin Kaepernick. And they said that was critical race theory. When I went there, and this isn't the educators who were responsible for this, was a school district, but I reminded them by talking about the Challenger episode from 1986. And I said, well, how is Challenger connected to this? If you think about the crew for the Challenger, it's not just significant because Krista McAuliffe was going to be the first teacher in space. There was an Asian American represented on that crew. There was an African American represented on that crew, several women. It was this aspirational moment in which, if you think about the space program, it was in its own limited way reflective of progress. At the same time, each one of those individuals had a story to tell about how they got there. Ronald McNair's story is what Al Sharpton said, the story of Black folks in America. Certainly, that's a wonderful way to think about that moment, but I like to remind those folks who want to politicize this, that Ronald Reagan, who was then president, in a speech that everyone loves to quote, where he talks about the astronauts slipping the surly bonds of Earth, also said in that speech, there are young children watching today, and our educators have a responsibility to talk about what happened here and the failures in this moment, so they'll be equipped in the future to be able to address them, to help us continue the progress and the pioneering work of moving forward and perfect. I just like to remind folks when they come and say, oh, well, this is, if the paragon of the right and conservatism said that, I'm not quoting Kennedy, I'm quoting Martin Luther King, then certainly I would argue that in this moment, when we see how race is negatively impacting, how sexism is negatively impacting, how challenges over immigration, anti-Asian violence are negatively impacting the very fabric of our republic, maybe they should take the advice of Ronald Reagan.
Thank you. So the next question comes from Tiffany Razavi. Thank you for a brilliant lecture. I really appreciate your approach and the explicit connection with the themes of the Baha'i Chair. It was so helpful. My question is about narratives. What are your thoughts about the most urgent needs and the basis for creating a new narrative going forward?
That's an incredible question. That's an incredible question, and I have given a lot of thought to that. We're working on a project now through the Racial Justice Initiative on a documentary on policing, because we recognize the importance of kind of shifting the narrative. But I think it's something that we do in concert. It's why I was so honored to be invited to speak here, not only because I love the work of Kate and Hoda and the chair, but also because I think the principles associated with this are about rethinking narratives. And doing so in a way that consciously recognizes that that work is important. It's why today, and I may have done it imperfectly and inadequately, but I wanted to center the voices of Black women consciously. We need to make conscious decisions about what we talk about and how we talk about them to open us up to the reality that the dominant narrative, even when it's coming in, I mentioned Raisin in the Sun, people often think that they describe that as kind of death of a salesman for Black people. It isn't. Beneatha denies that, because in that character, what Lorraine Hansberry creates for us is an alternative reality where maybe we should be thinking globally about the spiritual gifts and talents that we develop to think about promoting peace and justice and equity in all the spheres that we touch. And what a different world it would be if we could imagine it around that.
Thank you. From Maggie Delaney. I'm about to double major in criminology and public policy because I'm interested in targeting the injustices in the justice system. Do you have any pointers or advice that I should keep in mind while I am still in college?
Phenomenal question, Maggie. Number one, I love that pairing of majors, but I would suggest three things to you very quickly. Part of the challenge, and people talk about critical race theory, and definitely make sure that you're taking some coursework that will expose you to the history and culture of the people and the communities that you'll serve. One of the biggest challenges that we have now is that on university campuses, there's a pushback in the humanities against things like modern and classical languages, and this argument that somehow that's not important. I would argue that now more than ever, it's absolutely essential. Study abroad is essential. African-American studies, absolutely essential. Cultural studies, ethnic studies, absolutely essential. The tragedy of 2020, 2021, and unfortunately what's shaping up to be 2022 is we haven't learned these lessons. And this idea that we're going to have a sanitized, whitewashed history that'll equip people to go out and to make change in areas that desperately need people who are thinking outside the box persist. So I would say that to you first is definitely, you've got a good pairing of majors there. But the real key now is how can you think outside the box of what can you bring to that work that would make you an innovator in that space, particularly to tackle the issues that you believe are pertinent to the communities that you want to serve. Number two, thank you for wanting to go into that work. I want to be very clear. We need young people who are passionate about reimagining public safety. And notice I'm not saying policing, to go into that work and to start from a model, not of deficit, but a model of shared humanity. We saw this here in the Twin Cities. It was a woman who was beaten in a carjacking here, and she went on the news, and they were talking about her injuries that she sustained. What I loved about what she said is she said, the young people who stole my car did this at 4:30 in the afternoon, but I want to share with everybody that we have to stop throwing young people away. We need a model of restorative justice. We have to reclaim these young people. We have to ask questions about not why are there carjacking people at 4:30 in the afternoon, but what after school programs there are. And in a global pandemic, when school's out, I just thought it was beautiful that this human being in this moment recognized the humanity of those who attacked her and recognized that this is a complex human challenge for us to overcome. That's where we need folks to be. And the fact that you're doing that and committing yourself to that work is inspiring. So keep going, but I would say definitely think outside the box. And I would also say, last but not least, don't wait to get into the profession before you begin to interrogate what's wrong with the profession. The classes that you take now are going to be about the mechanics of the job. You want to think about the philosophical underpinnings of the work, and that's critical.
Thank you. So that actually flows nicely into the next question from Michelle Warch. Dr. Williams, thank you for your exceptional presentation. In what arenas should racial justice work focus? For instance, what aspects of restorative justice and particularly reparations might become a focus for advocacy?
Phenomenal question. I'm chairing the St. Paul Committee on Reparations now. We're going through that work in the city of St. Paul after the city council here passed a resolution to look into past harm. And restorative justice as a model, I think, is incredibly important in criminal justice, but I think it also should, there are tenets of conversation about restorative justice that would be helpful in other areas, particularly those related to any aspect of conversations associated with equity. So certainly there's an element of dealing with the social determinants of health that at its core is about restorative justice and about reparations. And I don't just mean in terms of recognizing a harm. That would be a kind of a more legalistic clinical definition. This community was harmed and we are paying back the debt owed to this community by virtue of that harm. The danger in that is that and not that I don't think that that's right. I think that there's real value in a community like St. Paul, for example, recognizing that they ran a federal highway through the Black neighborhood, displaced hundreds of African-American families, hundreds of businesses, and that those people who were so harmed have a right to restitution by virtue of those conscious decisions that were made that negatively impacted that community, that negatively impacted this community. There's a broader question. How do you ensure it never happens again? How do we put ourselves in a space where it's not just a conversation about trying to catch the horrible things that we did in the past, but that process of reimagination that we talked about during the lecture that begins with the premise that, yes, address that, but how do we create an equitable society? How do we create pathways to elevating voices, amplifying voices, that we don't replicate or recreate the very structures of injustice that we claim that we're dismantling?
Thank you very much. From Sherry Adland, very heavy material. I get so disheartened by people who don't seem able to see how racism exists or acknowledge that they even unknowingly participate. Are you familiar with Professor Alan Love and his work? If so, can you respond to his position that BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, need to earn equality as it won't be given to them? I may not understand it fully, but it felt awkward, and I worry that dominant society will use it as a way to ignore the problem of systemic racism and expect Blacks to fix the problem by themselves, which is not possible when whites hold the power. Open to some critique here, as like I said, I don't know I fully understand it.
Great question. And again, that's one of these questions of historical recovery. We can think about even as part of the racial uplift tradition, leaders in the African-American community who pursued a similar ideology. So Booker Taliaferro Washington famously talked about in his book, Up From Slavery, the need for African-Americans to kind of prove themselves. What we do know from that is that that model has never worked because it ultimately feeds the very racism and racial assumptions and elevates the structural racism that we're talking about dismantling. So it can't proceed from that. At the same time, there's something to be said for agency. And that's the idea. And I don't think this is what Dr. Love is talking about, but I'm not going to speak specifically to that work. I'm just going to frame it in a slightly different way. When we become hopeless and we assume that we can't make an impact, or we assume that we have to wait to be recognized. What I loved about Nakima Levy Armstrong the other day is that she didn't wait for the Q&A. She said, I'm taking the opportunity to be recognized. And I look at it in that way when I say that when we think about that activist spirit, it tends to manifest itself in people like Fannie Lou Hamer. Go back to the Democratic National Convention in 1964, waiting to be sat, and they take the floor and she speaks. The media blacked it out, but the reality is that she took and seized that opportunity because she recognized from a moral standpoint, it was the conscientious and right thing to do. I look at it in that sense, and that's where I would stay focused. Anyone who's suggesting to you that you need to earn in a participatory democracy, anyone who suggests other than any of the other attributes that other people have to fulfill to exercise basic fundamental rights, that you need to do more, is simply wrongheaded. That's not been the American enterprise. And I use that language very, very consciously.
Thank you. From Ruthie Vogel, thank you for your lecture, Dr. Williams. When talking about policing, you mentioned a framing of reimagine the police instead of defund the police. How do you think we can be fully aware of the framework that we're in now? What are some steps that you think are necessary to begin that process of reimagining?
Brilliant question. I'm involved. I'm in the same work now. We all are. We need to read more. We need to interrogate. We need to peel back the layer of the thin blue line, they call it. We can no longer let the police occupy as kind of a hermetically sealed Praetorian Guard, as Tony Boza, the former chief here in Minneapolis, described them at one point. And we need to be actively engaged in the work of, we need to stop policing as such a 19th century term. What's the terminology? I mean, I love public safety because that means mental health interventions. That means healthcare interventions. That means not broken windows policing, but community uplift public safety. Something that they're doing here in the Twin Cities, I think, is great. There's a grocery store that sits very close to challenged community, and they were having all these issues with shoplifting. They have police officers in there after the murder of George Floyd. They said, we're not going to do police officers training. We're going to have community members come in, and they're going to do not theft prevention. They're going to do community intervention. So when they catch somebody shoplifting now, they have an intervention where they say, what's the need? Like, this is restorative justice. We want to do business in this community. We recognize that people in this community have needs. And so therefore, we're going to get people from the community to work with us to do three things. Number one, we have to protect our inventory. We're not going to survive. That's business 101, and we recognize that, and we're going to be transparent about it. Number two, we're going to employ people from the community to work in our store, because that proves that we have an investment in the community, and we want them to be invested in us. But we're also going to create a space here where if people have needs or challenges, they see us not as a predator, but as a resource, as a member of the community. That's revolutionary to me. So I think when we're thinking in those terms about reimagining for public safety, not for policing, that's where we can go. I don't think that you can reimagine policing. I think this past week proves that you can't reform the police any more than, when the one thing that I will take from the defund movement, and again, I have challenges with that language. I think it's problematic. But what I love about what activists said in talking about that is they said, we spend so much time talking about reform, and we just kind of have to start all over again. You can start all over again from a baseline. That doesn't mean that people are going to be unsafe because there aren't police. It just means that you're not beginning with the same premises that continue things like no-knock warrants and felony disfranchisement and all the school to prison pipeline and suspensions and all the other things that are exacerbating problems with the criminal justice system in this country.
Thank you. So we have a question from Bader McGowan. I have to ask on your opinion about performative activism, where someone or a company says things which are pro-equality while participating in encouraging systems that work against those alleged goals.
A phenomenal question. I think performative allyship and performative activism is a challenge. I will say the interesting thing about this is, and I have a very different take because I work with a lot of corporations on these issues. The one good thing about it is if a company takes a very public stand, you can hold them accountable for the stand that they've taken. And that's a power that we haven't had in previous years, where corporations kind of stayed out of this sphere, and it was hard to put pressure on them to be accountable around issues of racial justice. But if you rushed out and put a statement out in support of the community with regard to justice for George Floyd, then if I'm a community member and I'm looking at that, you've just opened a door for me. So I'm going to build some metrics around that. And I'm going to try to reach out to you and say, hey, let's work on what this could look like in 10 years. Like, what are your 10-year aspirational goals for what you articulated? And oh, by the way, these policies, practices, and procedures that you're engaged in are problematic because they perpetuate these issues. And then you've got a basis for conversation, which previously we really didn't have when corporations weren't taking the public stand, when they acted, in a sense, like they were divorced from this. I've seen some corporations here do some pretty incredible things in spaces. I've also seen a lot of performative allyship and a lot of things that I have challenges with. my argument to corporations has always been around the idea of thinking about their core business and operating in that space. Because what ends up happening is everybody says they're going to come in and solve the issue of education, and then they get frustrated and go, this problem's too big, and within 2-3 years they're gone. They give a bunch of money, they leave. I don't want that from you. If you're a solid waste management company, recognize that solid waste management, collection, pest control, those are civil rights issues. I used to live in the city of Washington, D.C. I think about the story of SNCC in D.C. The organizing in that community was around pest control in Anacostia. It's a civil rights issue. You don't understand that until you live in a community that's overrun with pests and doesn't have regular trash collection. And so if you're in that area, your commitment to dealing with the death by 1,000 cuts that is racial inequality is to invest deeply in that area where you have longitudinal engagement, deep investment in resources. Then we can talk about long-term metrics, and you don't have to come back and say, we tried, but we were boiling the ocean. Boil the little pot of tea that you have here. And maybe if we get enough organizations to do that, we'll begin to make a difference in a larger sense. We have to do both. But I think that that's the way that you, at least for corporations, you can drive the conversation in a way that's more productive.
Thank you. Just a reminder that we have a few more minutes for questions. This one is from Sheraban Abdul Nabi. Do you think working in the accurate education of our children, who are the foundation of any future change, is a place to start? That is, change in educational system is a great urgency. Thank you for all you shared with us.
That's brilliant. Yeah, yes. If I had, I would completely reimagine public education as we know it. And I'm being very, and when I say public education, I mean public education, not charter schools. The pandemic has exposed, I think in a real sense, all the challenges that educators and activists have talked about with regard to the deeper issues of, that impact public education in this country. Underfunded schools are underfunded because there's a historical phenomena that people don't recognize. And talking about that, when deindustrialization happened in Baltimore and those corporations left Baltimore in the inner city, the resources for those schools are no longer there, but the population is still there. It's increasingly Black and brown. And so then if you're gonna make a deep investment in education, you have to rethink that investment or rethink that commitment. And when you allow, we talk about it here in St. Paul, something called pilot, payment in lieu of taxes. Who are the entities that are left in that community that are generating revenue? They need to step up and make a commitment to the future. Why should they do that? I don't even argue from a moral standpoint. I could. It would be consistent with what the Bahá'í chair, I think that I would love it if people were approaching it that way. And in fact, I'll lead with that. But I'd also say to the other folks, it's an investment in your workforce. It's an investment in infrastructure. It's an investment in the longitudinal existence of this place, this entity that you call the city of Baltimore, the city of St. Paul, or the city of Bridgeport, whatever it may be. So I think you can kind of approach it both ways. What I love about the question is that this is the work, is figuring out a way. Again, say what you will about my Challenger example, but I do love that in that moment, what President Reagan couldn't ignore was the fact that people stayed home to watch that shuttle go up because we were going to have the first teacher in space. And I always remind people that in that moment, there was this big conversation about who should be the first person to go into space. There were billionaires offering tons of money to be the first person to go. There were journalists who wanted to go, who said, we want to be able to document this. There were politicians. They chose a teacher. That also is powerful because they're saying there's something about education that's foundational. In our contemporary moment, when we talk about tackling racial justice and thinking about defeating structural racism, begin with the educators, because that is the future. They're going to literally shape the future. And we can't do that by putting handcuffs on them or creating such fear now that exists in public school, that you have public school educators in particular who feel like they can't do their jobs.
Well, that's the end of our questions. How timely. Again, Dr. Yohuru Williams, I can't thank you enough for your very, very important presentation today. I think it's a somber presentation, which awakens us to remind ourselves over and over again that there is so much work to be done in this area and that we should not ever feel like we can relax about it. And I was very happy that you mentioned the book Caste, because today my students from my class joined the lecture, and that's in fact the book that was due to be spoken about today and also for the next several class sessions. So we are glad to see that you actually already mentioned that book. But truly, on behalf of the Baha'i Chair, I sincerely would like to thank you again for joining us. I also would like to thank our other collaborators, the Anti-Black Racism Initiative, the Department of African American Studies, and the Critical Race Initiative in the Department of Sociology. And of course, we thank all of our viewers for joining us today. Let me just remind you about our upcoming lecture in March, March 15th. We will feature Dr. Anna Agathangelu from York University in the Department of Politics. And her topic is Decolonial and Radical Planetary Futures, Defantilizing Colonial Literacy and Imagination. She is a very, very creative scholar and speaker, and so we hope that you will join us on March 15th. There'll be several other events this semester, which we will post on our website, and we always ask you to follow us on our social media. And I'm very pleased to say that we have recorded today's lecture. I think it should be listened to over and over again, so that we will post that lecture today, Dr. Williams' lecture, on our YouTube channel. Again, Professor Yohuru Williams, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your lecture.
Thank you.
With that, I will say goodbye and hope to see you in March.